Hello, welcome back to my channel. I have another video for you today. This one I'm going to do on first lines because I think it's a vital, often underlooked or perhaps overlooked rather, aspect of writing, especially short stories and fiction. Now, a lot of stuff is written on first paragraphs, first pages, but the first line is really often a person's first encounter with a book. I mean, I don't know about you, but I often, when I'm thinking about buying a novel by someone I'm not familiar with, I'll quickly flick to the first line or two and read them, and if it impresses me in some way, then I'll consider buying it. So what I've done is I've taken some classics from my shelves. I deliberately haven't looked at them again because I think it'll be interesting to react in real time. So I've got some fantasy, I've got some classic literature, some science fiction, and a sort of relatively, well, last 20 years modern classic. So we'll have a look at them and see what we come up with, see what the first lines are and how they work. First one I'm going to look at is Lewis Carroll, Alice Adventures in Wonderland. This is from the 19th century, so let's turn to the first page of Alice in Wonderland. Chapter 1 is called Down the Rabbit Hole. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it, and of what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? So actually, yeah, I remember that opening. It's actually quite a famous sort of character quote, what's the use of a book without pictures or conversations? And it's actually the whole first paragraph is taken up by that first sentence. So it sets the scene nicely. We've got Alice. She's the first word of the first sentence is Alice, so we know that she's the protagonist. She's tired of sitting by her sister on the bank, having nothing to do, so, you know, this is setting us up for something to dramatically come in and set the story going. And her sister's reading a book, but it doesn't have pictures or conversations. So it kind of sets up this philosophical premise of, you know, what is a story visual? Is it spoken? Is it to do with language, or is it to do with imagery? And as you know, the whole world of Alice in Wonderland is about things getting bigger or smaller or distorting. So yeah, it's a sort of intriguing opening. It's a sort of soft opening, but it throws out a question. It ends with a question mark. So actually, quite intriguing. So you definitely want to read on if you somehow hadn't encountered the concept of Lewis Carroll or Alice in Wonderland. Another relatively modern classic, Animal Farm. See this nice old paperback copy. George Orwell has one of the most famous openings of any modern novel, I think 1984. I can't remember it exactly, but it's something to do with the clock striking 13. I mean, it's a fantastic opening line. I don't have that novel, so I didn't choose that, but I'm going to choose Animal Farm, see if he's just as good on this one. Mr. Jones of the Manor Farm had locked the hen houses for the night, but was too drunk to remember to shut the pop holes. Interesting, right. So we've got Mr. Jones. Now you might think Mr. Jones is going to be a protagonist. He isn't the protagonist of this, so that's an interesting choice. We know that this is happening on a farm. He's drunk, which is interesting. And there's this intriguing word, pop holes. Now I don't know what a pop hole is, and I'm not even sure you find out what a pop hole is. Maybe it's the holes that the hens emerge from. That could be it. So it doesn't really give you much. I mean, it gives you a sort of, it sets the scene of where we are. So that's another thing, obviously, the first line can do. So we know we're on a farm. There's a farmer. He's a little bit lax. He's a little bit drunk, and he's forgotten to shut the pop holes. But we have to read further, really, to find out much more. So that's kind of another soft opening. Interesting, but, you know, not quite as classic as the Alice in Wonderland. One of my favourite writers, Bernard Malamud, slightly out of fashion, but fantastic American Jewish writer of the mid-20th century. This is one of his first, I think maybe his second novel, called The Assistant. He's a great stylist of language, particularly of spoken dialogue. But let's just see what the first line is. The early November street was dark, though night had ended, but the wind, to the grocer's surprise, already clawed. Now, this is good. So we know it's November, it's dark. The character's called the grocer, so he's not given a name. But what that does instead is tell you that his profession, being a grocer, is significant and important, as it turns out in the rest of the novel. And then we end with the word clawed, already clawed. That's a great, very strong verb to end with. And in fact, ending with a verb is unusual as well. But yeah, so that's a great scene-setting opening line, and it does set up a significant character, which is Morris the grocer. We'll find out he's called Morris later. Fantastic. There, I'll read it again. The early November street was dark, though night had ended, but the wind, to the grocer's surprise, already clawed. So wait a minute. Night has ended. That suggests it's very early in the morning. So he's a grocer who works hard, gets up early, opens his store, even when it's really cold and there's a clawing wind. So yeah, so it's a great character introduction, setting, even theme, because you know the theme of survival against all odds, of struggle, of the kind of working man trying to make ends meet. It's very much in this book, and it's there in the first line. Great work, Malamud, as ever. Another one of my favourite authors from childhood, Ray Bradbury. Another stylist, another linguistic stylist, very unusual among science fiction writers. He's very poetic, which you'll hear from this. Now, I did have a look at this earlier, and I'm going to read the first line of the actual thing, and then the first line of the second story, because the first story is really a one-page prologue, which I suspect he added later, called Rocket Summer, and it starts like this. It's actually set January 1999. Ooh, way in the future, when you're writing in the 50s, maybe 40s, I don't know. Anyway, one minute it was Ohio winter, with doors closed, windows locked, the panes blind with frost, icicles fringing every roof, children skiing on slopes, housewives lumbering like great black bears in their furs along the icy streets. That's the rhythm in that is fantastic. The use of unusual verbs, or adjectives. The panes blind with frost, icicles fringing every roof, children skiing on slopes, housewives lumbering. So you have these. He's very good at rhythm. It's incredible, sort of poetic narrative storytelling. It sets up the location really, really well. You know that something unusual is going to happen, and it does in fact in the next line, because it goes on to say, and then a long wave of warmth crossed the small town. And it's about how the rocket launches during the early days of, the space program, American space program, were such a kind of incredible radical shake-up of what was happening in the Ohio neighborhoods. I mean, I don't think they were launching rockets in Ohio, but this is set in the future, as he was writing then. Anyway, and then it goes on to a very different opening for the next story, because this is really a collection of stories kind of loosely bound together into a narrative. Compare this. They had a house of crystal pillars on the planet Mars by the edge of an empty sea, and every morning you could see Mrs. K eating the golden fruits that grew from the crystal walls, or cleaning the house with handfuls of magnetic dust, which, taking all dirt with it, blew away on the hot wind. So yeah, we're definitely some are exotic, some are very different now. We've got strangenesses like crystal pillars. We've got the edge of an empty sea, which is intriguing. How can a sea be empty? Was it somewhere where there used to be a sea that dried up? And then we've got Mrs. K, which is strangely domestic, but not given a name. Golden fruits, crystal walls, and magnetic dust. So we've got so many alien concepts there that somehow, we know what golden is, we know what crystal is, we know what magnetic is. So we can get a sort of idea of what these things are, but they're definitely strange. and then blew away on the hot wind. So that gives us a flavour of what the environment's like. It's quite harsh. Actually, relatively close to what we know is the surface of Mars, but with added atmosphere in this version, presumably. Yeah, great opening. Again, one of the best in the business. We're going to jump back to the 19th century again, to Wuthering Heights, another one of my favourite novels by Emily Bronte. This will be quite different, I suspect. Let's have a look. Can I remember? Wuthering Heights, Chapter 1. Oh, there we go. 1801. Well, technically that's the first line, because there's a full stop after it, but I'm going to read on. 1801. I have just returned from a visit to my landlord, the solitary neighbour that I shall be troubled with. Okay, that's it. But we don't know who's speaking, but we know that they're solitary and that the main character will be troubled with. And that's interesting. How do they know? How do they know this is going to be a troublesome neighbour? Yeah, so I mean, it just sets up intrigue, really. And there are a lot of quite short sentences that follow. So really the whole first paragraph gives you a lot more. It goes on to say, this is certainly a beautiful country. In all England, I do not believe I could have fixed on a situation so completely removed from the stir of society. A perfect misanthropist's heaven, and Mr. Heathcliff and I are such a suitable pair to divide the desolation between us. So Heathcliff, one of the main characters in the book, obviously, comes in the third or fourth line. But already he's there in the first line because he's the solitary neighbour that he shall be troubled with. Trouble didn't mean quite the same thing then as it does now. I think it maybe have a more general sense of I will be involved with, But actually it's interesting that it has that. I'm sure it was a conscious choice that troubled also has that negative connotation. So yes, another one of those interesting, subtle first lines. And finally, we're going to go to a modern classic, Cloud Atlas, which was filmed, as you know, by David Mitchell. He's a very interesting writer who kind of writes on the periphery of science fiction and literary fiction, the intersection thereof. Now, you probably know, well maybe you don't, but Cloud Atlas is a nested set of narratives which start in a version of the distant past and then project forward into the future and then go right back to the past again. So it's a very unusual book. But this is how he chooses to open it. Thursday the 7th of November. Beyond the Indian hamlet, upon a forlorn strand, I happened on a trail of recent footprints. So, we know that we're not in the present because that is an archaic way of speaking. We know we're in India. Upon a forlorn strand is very slightly archaic way of describing a beach. I happened upon, again, it's a great phrase, but it's not very common parlance nowadays. And then a trail of recent footprints. And obviously, I think to the semi-literate reader, this will probably put you in mind of Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe, because obviously famously that's how he discovers Man Friday. Probably a problematic book, I would suspect these days, but it was the 18th century. He first realizes he's not alone on this island when he discovers a trail of footprints. So I think that's probably a conscious choice by David Mitchell to put you in mind of that book, which will obviously then encourage you to look for an 18th century sort of narrative, adventure narrative. And I don't actually remember exactly what happens in that first section of the book, but I think it is pretty much a sort of, not quite a parody, but a homage to that kind of adventurous 18th century narrative. It does things like it uses ampersands, the symbol for and, instead of the word and, which was a common sort of shortcut of the time. Anyway, so that's... Also, I realised that, let me just check. Indian Hamlet. You might be using Indian in the sort of generic sense they had at the time of Aboriginal. I don't know, I can't remember. So that's Cloud Atlas. And now I'm going to go through some of my own stories from this book, partly because I want to sell copies, let's be honest, but partly because I kind of want to think a bit harder about my choices. So what I try and do with the first sentence is give the reader an expectation of what kind of world they're going to be in, what story world they're going to be in, what genre, what to expect from it. And usually I try and put in a bit of surprise. Sometimes I do the cold opening where it's, a fairly generic first line, but I like to put something unusual in to keep the reader reading. So I'm going to read you, I've chosen 5 stories from Running Coyote and Fallen Star, available for $6.99 on Amazon or $2.99 on Kindle as an ebook. So the first one's called The Pact, and I think most of these stories are actually on my YouTube channel in full, so you could listen to them if you enjoy what I'm about to read. But The Pact starts like this. Did you ever get to the point where you thought, I can't go on? Susie asked Carroll. So we have the 2 protagonists. We have Susie, we have Carroll. We have Susie asking Carroll a philosophical question, and it's quite a dark question. We don't know yet whether she literally means suicide or whether she means just giving up on something. But it's a good way. Maybe it's an easy way, but it's a good way to start stories with a question. Obviously, we want the answer to that question. We are curious creatures, humans, so we want to know what Carl's going to answer. And I'm not going to tell you, so you'll have to read the story or listen. You can listen to the story for free on the channel, or you can buy the book. But that's one strategy that I've used there. The next one is called Black Cubes, which starts, in a top secret location in the Nevada desert lurked the Theoretical Incursion Center. So we know what genre we're in now, obviously. We know we're in science fiction, because anything called the Theoretical Incursion Center is bound to be intriguing, odd, futuristic, strange. And we know we're in the Nevada desert, and it's top secret. So hopefully this gives you a very quick clue into the kind of thing you're going to read. It's going to be science fiction. It might have thriller aspects to it. The Theoretical Incursion Center is a bit of a strange name, which suggests that we might be verging into parody, maybe. It's not entirely likely that there would be a real place called that. So, and that is exactly what I do with the rest of the story. I don't want to give the impression I think for hours and hours agonizingly about the first line. Most of the time it's intuitive. But you do write enough stories and you will have a confidence when you've hit a good first line. It just becomes intuitive second nature to do so. So let's have a look at the third example is from a story called Allies in the Deep. Enfolded in blankets on the top shelf of the walk-in wardrobe, Kathy heard the sound of her family being eviscerated. So I think it's fairly clear that this is not going to be a particularly nice story. This is a horror, kind of a horror story with aspects of science fiction, as you will find out if you read on. The word eviscerated is one of those fantastic words that's almost onomatopoeic. It kind of has a brutality to the sound of it, and actually similar to, who was it again? I can't remember which example it was. One of the other examples ended with a strong, powerful, and unusual verb, which I've done here. It's like a punchline to a joke, You read all the way to the end of the sentence, think, oh, this is nice. Sound of her family being, led around, shown around the farm. No, eviscerated. So, pretty brutal. We also know, obviously, that Kathy's the main character. She's able to hide in blankets on the top shelf of a walk-in wardrobe, so we know she's probably a child. I mean, if you think about it, unless you've got a bloody enormous walk-in wardrobe, which, yeah, maybe you do. but we know what to expect next. Obviously, there's going to be some action, there's going to be some horror, some brutality, and hopefully Kathy will escape. Again, if you want to find out, you'll have to look at the video on this channel or buy the book. And the last one is called You Want It More Vibrant, with a question mark. And it's a very short sentence. It starts, I'm a plasterer and a drummer and a failure. So what I think I've probably unconsciously borrowed from Ray Bradbury is the rhythm concept, you know. But also remember, he's a drummer, so I'm a plasterer and a drummer and a failure. It's got a rhythm to it, you know. It's a drummer's sentence, really. I'm a plasterer and a drummer and a failure. So yeah, you could write a song around that if you were so inclined. Also, it's in the first person, so we know that the story is going to be told by the character to whom things happen. And very straightforwardly tells you his job, he's a plasterer, his pastime, he's a drummer, and then he says, and a failure. Now, we don't know at this point whether he's being absolutely serious. Does he really think that? Or is he being ironic? And then the next line does clarify, because the next line goes on to say, well, in the eyes of my father, best friend and ex-wife respectively, that's what I am. So then the father thinks he's a plasterer. Maybe the father's also a plasterer. His best friend knows him as a drummer. They're in a band together. And his ex-wife thinks he's a failure, which is fair enough. She's his ex-wife. So it's not, you know, it's not like he's utterly depressed and bereft of hope. But yeah, it's got that, again, it's got that sort of surprise element, you know. Usually when people tell you about themselves, they wouldn't say something like, I'm a failure. So for him to be talking to us and being so honest also clues the reader in that they're going to get something very honest. They're not going to get someone who's concealing the truth. They're probably going to be someone who's painfully honest, maybe at the expense of others. Yeah, it's not, it doesn't make you think you're going to get an unreliable narrator. And actually, I think this character is relatively straightforward. The twist that happens in the story is more to do with his behaviour or how he deals with adversity than with any disjoint between what he thinks of himself and what the world thinks of him. So, again, yeah, it's a very simple, straightforward first line, which does a lot of work as well. So anyway, those are 5 of my first lines from this book. And I hope you enjoyed that little breakdown of first lines, how they work, what they can do. Don't underestimate them, because if you come up with a cracking first line, you will make your reader want to at least read the first paragraph or the first page. So it's kind of like, if the first line can be brilliant, the first paragraph can be great, and the first page can be really good, you're onto a winner. Ideally, it can all be excellent, but then you might spend the rest of your life honing one short story, and you'll never get anywhere. You have to write. You have to keep writing. Keep churning out the work. You know, polish it as much as you can, but you know, work on instinct. Work fast. Keep writing. Hopefully, this has been inspiring to any of you that are writers, and I will see you again very soon. Bye bye.